Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is August 13th, 2024, and our topic tonight is on the Panama Canal and its role in U.S. imperialism. This class is being brought to you in collaboration with the Cervantes Fraternal Society, one of our sister mass organizations. We will start the presentation. So our class tonight will be broken into three sections. We will have a history section of Colombia, of Panama when it was before Panama. We will have the second part when it became a vassal of U.S. imperialism or as an outpost. And we will also end tonight with showing of a clip from the movie The Panama Deception, which was all about the 1989 riots in Panama and some of the history of U.S. imperialist actors behind politics and the canal itself in Panama. So, Comrade, you have our first section. You have the floor.
Yes, hello. We are dealing with Panama history, from pre-imperialism to U.S. imperialist outpost. On the left here, we have a picture of Manuel Maria Mallarino, an 1885 painting by Ramon Torres Menendez. The slide starts off with, the region was initially part of the Spanish Empire. It gained independence from Spain in 1819. There was a separate Panama independence at the same time that joined the newly independent United Provinces of New Granada in 1821. The Mallarino-Bidlack Treaty, a treaty signed between New Granada, today Colombia and Panama, and the United States on December 12, 1846, U.S. Prime Minister Benjamin Alden Bidlack negotiated the pact with New Granada Secretary of Foreign Affairs Manuela Maria Mallarino. It was a treaty of peace, friendship, commerce, and navigation, and was meant to represent an agreement of mutual cooperation. It granted the U.S. significant transit rights over the Panamanian Isthmus, as well as military powers. Under the treaty, the U.S. intervened militarily many times on the Isthmus, usually against civilians, peasant guerrillas, or Liberal Party independent struggles. And as you see, there's a picture of the New Granada province. The Californian Gold Rush and Panama Railroad construction. The Isthmus of Panama had long had importance to U.S. capitalists and interests, as it was a quick way to refit trans-ocean ships and shortened the length of time to get to the West Coast areas. The Californian Gold Rush of 1848 moved the U.S. to construct a trans-Isthmian Panama Railway. The railway opened a path for U.S. influence and control economically and politically of Panama. The United States actually gained rights in 1848 from the then Republic of New Granada to safeguard the neutrality of the Isthmus, which came to be interpreted as safeguarding United States interests. In 1878, a French company had begun construction of a canal on the Isthmus of Panama, which failed in 1889, and the original company went bankrupt. 20,000 plus workers died building that canal due to disease. Despite this, American and French capitalists, along with local compradors, began to plan on how to start the project once again. The Panama Watermelon Riot of April 15, 1856. The Isthmus was used as a transit point to the Pacific for the American companies and people. Local resentment against these foreign interlopers came to a head in 1856. After an American took a slice of watermelon from a street vendor and refused to pay for it, a verbal altercation ensued, then quickly escalated when shots were fired. An angry mob of locals converged on the site and began fighting with the Americans. Before order could be restored, at least 15 Americans and 2 Panamanians were killed. American businesses, including the railroad station, were extensively damaged or destroyed. This incident gave the United States an excuse to intervene further in Panamanian affairs. Independence from Colombia. The United States had negotiated a treaty, the Hay-Huron Treaty, with Colombia in January of 1903 that would have given a 6-mile strip of land leased on the canal zone for $40 million. A French company that would be called the New Panama Canal Company would build it. The U.S. ratified it, but Colombia did not. Fearing a loss of investment and money, French and American capitalists began to push the U.S. government and then President Theodore Roosevelt into backing Panama separately. In November of 1903, Panama, tacitly supported by the United States, proclaimed its independence and concluded the Hay-Bernal-Virillia Treaty with the United States without the presence of a single Panamanian. This treaty was the seizure of a 10-mile wide strip of land in the Panama Isthmus. Felipe Jan Bernal-Virillia, a French engineer and lobbyist of the New Panama Canal Construction Company, represented Panama even though Panama's president and delegation had arrived in New York to negotiate their own treaty. No actual Panamanians were represented in this conference. Bernal-Virillia had met Manuel Amador, the leader of the Panamanian independence movement. In a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York of November 1903, Bernal-Virillia wrote Amador a $100,000 check to fund a renewed Panamanian revolt. In return, Bernal-Virillia would become Panama's representative in Washington. Panama independence and construction of the Panama Canal. Panama was made independent from Colombia in November of 1903. The U.S., with French capitalist support and with none of the Panamanian people, would seize the area of the canal zone and declare it as sovereign territory. Manuel Amador was sworn as the first president with the support of a U.S. battleship, the USS Nashville. The treaty created a 5-mile zone on either side of the U.S. that the U.S. claimed sovereignty over. This treaty was signed even though the president of Panama had been on the way with his own delegation. They were not consulted on this treaty. This unequal treaty remained in effect until 1977 with the Trujillo-Carter Treaty. The U.S. changed the racial makeup of the from the Spaniards and the Panamanian natives with a mixture of cheap Asian, Caribbean, Afro-Americans, and native labor from the Caribbean to be for construction of the Panama Canal. The U.S. had 55,000 workers on the canal, with about 55,600 of them dying due to disease and injury. The canal was constructed from 1903 to 1914. U.S. created apartheid and segregated societies. The U.S. troops treated everyone who were not Americans as inferior. This was exacerbated by a lot of U.S. troops being from the South. Many Panamanian natives were now second-class citizens within their own country.
Thank you, comrade. We will now break for a first round of discussion. If you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand function and we will get to you in the order that they go up. Just a couple notes I wanted to say. In researching this was rather fascinating, as Manuel Arador happened to be, with his brother, one of the people that had financed the original French construction back in 1878. So there was already a history he had with the canal's construction. And then the pictures of the mustached man of Varela, he actually was part of the funding people and had his own lobbying group that was with the new French construction. And it was through that group that they had direct connections to Theodore Roosevelt. Whereas after the Columbia Congress did not ratify the treaty that was signed, they feared they would lose the $40 million that had been set aside by the United States Congress for the construction of the Panama Canals. So there's been a very long history of U.S. imperial involvement in the region, and it's been utterly fascinating to unravel all those balls. But Emeritus Secretary Comrade Angelo, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to remind people that nothing has changed. The United States did the same thing recently in Yugoslavia. They divided the country, destroyed it, and set up Kosovo as a separate independent republic and have the biggest military base in Europe. The American military is in Kosovo. So nothing has changed. The other thing is that I want to be corrected on this if I'm not. When I was in school, I learned about something called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine goes into this kind of situation that the Latin America, South America, Central America was the backyard of American foreign interest and they controlled it. Can anybody give me some background on that? Because it looks like Teddy Roosevelt was using that. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. And yes, on that, while the European imperialist powers were carving up Africa, the Monroe Doctrine basically said that the Americas was the United States, and any European power ostensibly that tried to make a colony there would be met by U.S. interests, but it was basically imperialism in that sense.
Yeah, so I mean, the Monroe Doctrine came before the age of imperialism. I mean, it was in the age of colonialism. Initially, it was used to keep the European powers out of the New World, but later on it became used as a justification for U.S. having free reign over international affairs in the Western Hemisphere. So I think the beginning and how it was later used are completely different questions, and it might be interesting to have a whole class on the Monroe Doctrine in the future.
I agree. And then I think probably one of the larger ones was when France interfered in Mexico, and that was right when the Civil War was going on. But then after that, I think parts of the cabinet wanted to march all the Union soldiers south to Mexico if the French didn't leave. So whether how much it was for that, who can say? But there was definitely a desire behind that.
The Monroe Doctrine was under President Monroe, and it was after the Spanish South American colonies had their war for independence, like Mexico and Chile and Venezuela, and under Simon Bolivar, and after the Napoleonic War, the Holy Alliance some of them wanted to help Spain recover the colonies, but the British opposed that because they had business interests there, didn't want to lose them to the Spanish, and so they encouraged the U.S. The U.S. wanted to have their own declaration, just to have, rather than having one with the British, to saying that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to new European colonization. So that was against European colonialism at the time, at least.
Thank you, Comrade.
Yeah, sorry if this is off topic or if it's something that comes up later in the presentation. But I've recently heard something about Nicaragua trying to construct an alternative to the Panama Canal. Does anyone know anything about that?
Yes. So my understanding is they are looking to do a alternative canal that's going to cut through that inland lake in Nicaragua, whose name's escaping me, and then it would go out from that way. But okay. Yes, though I believe last I heard there was financial backing and interest from the Chinese in Nicaragua to construct that project, and I think there's been some work on it, but how far it's gotten, it's kind of disappeared from the news. As soon as there's some spook, I guess, to U.S. imperialism, it pops up, but then they don't give too many details about why are they doing this? Why are they making this alternative route from the Panama Canal? Can't start asking those questions now, can we?
Oh yeah, Like I forgot. I just thought like, when did the New Granada like collapse? I didn't know it lasted as long as the 1850s. I thought it like collapsed shortly after the death of Bolivar in the 1830s. I didn't know it was still around that late.
No, so New Granada started out as the United Provinces of New Granada, which nowadays it's Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, and some northwestern parts of Brazil. In 1819, it became a viceroyalty for a bit of that title. There was a short-lived Republic of New Granada. And then there was sometime in the 1870s, it became the United States of Greater Colombia. And then in the 1880s, it was actually the Republic of Colombia, which has its name to this day.
Okay.
Yeah, so 4 years prior to the U.S. acquiring the 1903, same president, Theodore Roosevelt, led the Spanish-American War, 1899, which was, essentially the U.S. getting its feet wet in the imperialist sphere. I was just curious, we didn't really talk much about the Spanish-American War, if all. Did that have any impact on it, on the creation of the Panama Canal?
So as kind of mentioned earlier, there had always been an interest in a canal on the isthmus because, for one, it was a lot easier to get to California, especially during the gold rush, by going through the Caribbean, across the isthmus, and then up the west coast instead of either going all the way around South America or even taking like the Oregon Trail or others. So there was always an interest for that. And a lot of businesses had heavily invested in that area, American interests, because one, there was also a booming American tourists, and also just settlers wanting to go from the eastern U.S. to the west coast easier. So there was always strong American interests in that area. I would say probably, if anything, the Spanish-American War, you had fighting on Cuba, and then also they took the Philippines from the Spanish as well. So the Isthmus of Panama would have been doubly important for getting material and munitions out from the east coast of the U.S. all the way out there for that theater. But if someone else has a different analysis, feel free. You have the floor. Go ahead.
No, on something slightly different. My understanding is, as it is in American history, it was always immigrants in the most brutal conditions that helped build the railroads, let that be the Irish or the Chinese. And I believe they sent some Irish workers to work on the railroads, if I'm not mistaken. And the way that the Irish treated the darker skinned people was kind of, racist, to say the least. And there was that dynamic where there was almost like a hierarchy, and it was racial. Even though the Irish were brought into the US in worse conditions, it's like when they went to Panama, they had like this sense of hierarchy. And you could see why that was useful for the company. Well, because to pit, people against each other, workers against each other, so that they wouldn't, do something like, I don't know, strike or start a revolution, perhaps.
Right on. And also during this time, tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria were widespread, and lots of people died from those sicknesses building the canals. And that's a whole other history as well. Our second section will be Panama as a U.S. imperialist outpost.
Banana Wars. Most prominently, the U.S. was advancing economic, political, and military interests in order to maintain its sphere of influence and to secure the Panama Canal, which opened in 1914. The U.S. had recently built the Panama Canal in order to dominate the hemisphere and to project its naval power. U.S. companies such as the United Fruit Company, Nestle, and Standard Fruit Company, now Dole plc, also had financial stakes in the production of bananas, tobacco, sugarcane, and other commodities throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and Northern South America. Many U.S. government officials, like the Dulles brothers and capitalists, owned stakes in these companies. The Panama Canal and the Isthmus were used by the U.S. empire to maintain its interests and put down movements of self-representation by the locals. Awareness of imperialism, full-blown resistance. Panamanian locals resented the foreign occupation of their country, and in the Cold War sought to reclaim sovereignty of the country from U.S. interests and occupation. This gained momentum following the events of May 21st, 1958, November 3rd, 1959, and on January 9th, 1964. The latter day is known in Panama as the Martyrs' Day, in which a riot over the right to raise the Panamanian flag at an American school occurred in the vicinity of the Panama Canal. The following years saw a lengthy negotiation process with the United States, culminating with the Torrijos-Carter treaties. In September 7th, 1977, in which the transfer of the Panama Canal to Panama was set to be completed in December 1999. The process of transition, however, was made difficult by U.S. officials who wanted to delay the process, and the friction the U.S. had with rule of Manuel Noriega in Panama from 1982 to 1989. Panamanian resistance against U.S. imperialism. May 21st, 1958, and November 3rd, 1959. In 1958 to 1959, there were serious disorders and demands to fly the Panamanian flag in the Canal Zone, leading U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower to declare the titular sovereignty over the zone residing within Panama. He also ordered that flags of both nations be displayed at specific places in the zone. Panamanian resistance against U.S. imperialism, January 9th, 1964, Martyrs' Day. Martyrs' Day in Panama is a day of national mourning that commemorates the anti-American riots that took place on January 9th, 1964, over the sovereignty of the Panama Canal Zone. The riots began when a Panamanian flag was torn and Panamanian defenseless students were killed with American guns during a conflict with Canal Zone police officers and residents. Panama Canal's role in U.S. wars. World War II. The U.S. stationed 65,000 troops in Panama to occupy the canal following Pearl Harbor. The canal was also of vital importance to U.S. imperialism in the Cold War. The canal was used to send troops, munitions, and personnel around the world in support of U.S. interests. The Torrijos-Carter Treaty. Following continued opposition to U.S. imperialism, in 1977, the government of Jimmy Carter negotiated with the then head of Panama, General Omar Torrijos. The treaty signed revoked the Hay-Banua-Varilla Treaty and stipulated the U.S. turning the canal over to Panama by 1999. Torrijos himself died in a plane crash that both the Soviet Union and later Manuel Noriega claimed were orchestrated by U.S. imperialists. Manuel Noriega, the CIA asset, turned head of state. Manuel Noriega, Trujillo's head of intelligence, was an alumni of the infamous CIA-backed School of the Americas and had been involved in disruptions of union activity within the United Fruit Company and was the head of government following Trujillo's death. Though declared a valuable asset by President Lyndon B. Johnson and on CIA payrolls, by 1980, his relationship with U.S. capitalists and the U.S. government was souring due to his continued contact and support of Cuba and refusal to assist with invading Nicaragua and to assist the Contras. Noriega was also involved with weapons and drug smuggling through CIA funding, but this was ignored in the 1960s until U.S. imperialists had no more use for him by the late 1980s. U.S. imperialists launched an invasion of Panama called Operation Just Cause to capture Noriega in December 1989. This is a picture of Operation Just Cause.
All right. Thank you, Comrade. Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
The comrade facilitating the class did a very thorough job, presenting the information. I was going to add more about Manuel Noriega, but it was said at the end, but I did want to mention also that the Operation Just Cause was launched specifically from the Panama Canal. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Yeah, Noriega was a rather interesting figure in that since the 1960s, he had been an asset and contacted the CIA and on their payroll. And in part of the movie we'll watch in a bit, apparently the CIA head under Carter actually cut him off because he was a bit like, oh, all the stuff you're doing is a little too much. But when Reagan became president, then Vice President George H.W. put him back on the CIA payroll and actually gave him a raise. And he's got, I think, a rather interesting relationship, or probably Pappy Bush knew him pretty well. But despite all this, Noriega refused. There was one proposition at point to have U.S. troops and Panama troops invade from Panama, Nicaragua, to top the Sandinistas and help the Contras. Noriega refused to go along with that. And in 1984, Noriega actually organized a conference of Latin American leaders to basically discuss how do we kick out the U.S. from meddling in our affairs, and that really ticked off some of the neocons in D.C.
Yeah, so this isn't the first class that we touched on the School of Americas. We also did it when we were talking about the Chilean coup of 1973. I really think we need to have a whole class on just the School of Americas, because they had their hand all over Latin America, and today they still exist. They're not called the School of Americas. They're called the Western Hemisphere Institute of Security Cooperation, and they are still backing fascist regimes all over Latin America to overthrow their governments. And I think we really need to have a class on just the School of Americas.
Agreed.
Yes, I just want to mention that my mother participated on the May 21st, 1958, as a student on the riots in Panama against the military presence of United States. And she actually got arrested. She was 18 years old. And my grandfather belongs to the Panamanian police force that she basically have to take her out. She have a very ingrained resentment with the presence of the U.S. and how they perpetrated the country for so many years.
Thank you.
That observation.
Thank you, Comrade. And I believe as well, were you a witness to the December 1989 invasion?
Correct, that's true. I was living actually in between bases. At that point, I'm living on a key street, and I was probably about less than 5 miles from Noriega headquarters in the area that I was. I was living on Balboa Heights, and I was between Noriega headquarters and Amador headquarters. And it was terrifying, the situation, even to my apartment. I was renting the apartment. It was one of those properties got returned back to the Panamanian government during the transition of the Torrijos Carter, and it was horrifying. I have MPs, military police, and actually guys in uniforms coming into my house looking for arms, and it was just me, Victoria's older brother, and a lady who used to help us babysit him. That it was terrifying. I do believe now, when I look back, that I did have PTSD about the situation, because it was horrible. We were unable to get food. We were unable to get groceries. We were unable to get out of our area. Everything was so secure, and the possibility of moving around the country was very, very limited.
Thank you for sharing your recollections of that. Make sure you change it.
Hi, I was just wondering, you were talking about the School of the Americas, and I remember that Juan Guaido was maybe associated with the School of the Americas. I was just wondering if anyone has any information about that or remembers anything about that. Kind of a modern example of a School of the Americas alum who they were trying to use to help overthrow, a government they didn't like. So.
Well, the possibility exists of Juan Guaido coming from, I believe it's Fort Benning, Georgia, Army School of the Americas. I believe Guaido went through something else. As mentioned by a comrade earlier, it's the School of the Americas has been renamed WIMSEC. It had a bad reputation, so now it's called WIMSEC. But another transition happened in the 80s up until today is a thing called the National Endowment for Democracy exists. So what previously might have all been done, maybe conducted like through military and like through training, and WIMSEC is still around. By the way, countries in Central Asia are training police and military at WIMSEC. And they have been since the early 2000s. So keep that in mind. But in Guaido in particular, another comrade can say this, but he went through, it was a different thing, a similar U.S. operation, but he was conducted through a different organization, Guaido. It was not a military one.
Thank you, comrade. I know that a lot of the junta leaders in Argentina are actually School of the America graduates, like Emilio Macera, and a lot of his higher-ups. I believe also Bolivia's Luis Arce Gomez was another one as well. Pinochet was not, but a lot of his higher officers were. Outside of that, I'm not 100% sure on other names.
Sorry if I'm butchering his name, but was Torriega the one who died in the plane crash? Was he any type of socialist or social democrat, or was it kind of just the one issue of the Panama Canal where he opposed U.S. imperialism?
So Torrio, I would not call him a socialist. I would call him more a Panamanian nationalist. He had previously disposed, and I'm blanking on the name, but the prior president who had some deep connections to, I think he went to school in New York, and he had some other connections with U.S. government officials. That prior president actually went to exile in Miami, I believe, until the 90s. But Trujillo was more looking out for Panamanian interests over U.S. interests. And it was the Trujillo-Carter treaties that really incensed a lot of neocons in the U.S. and other war hawks against him and proponents of U.S. imperialism. It was said his plane, when it crashed in 1981, that it was a plane failure. Witnesses, though, said it exploded in the sky. So there's been no concrete proof, but many say he was basically assassinated by someone for that, though. Like I said, they haven't concretely proven anything on that. And the film clip we're going to watch actually does touch on that a little bit. The movie is called The Panama Deception. This movie was made in 1992. It was a documentary. When it came out, it was actually outlawed in Panama entirely, and there was a restraining order or an order against showing it in many major news networks. But despite that, I believe there was some stations out of New York, Philly, Los Angeles, and one other place that defied that and basically showed it. But it's not a very wide-known documentary, but it's rather eye-opening, I believe. So.
1978, relations between the United States and Panama reached a high point. Jimmy Carter and Omar Torrijos negotiated treaties that abolished the 1903 treaty, establishing a new relationship between the two countries. The Carter-Torrijos treaties required the United States to vacate its military bases and withdraw its troops by the year 2000. full control of the canal and the canal zone would be turned over to Panama. Although these new treaties were a source of pride for Panamanians, many conservatives in the United States had vehemently opposed them.
The Panama Canal Zone is sovereign United States territory, just as much as Alaska is, as well as the states carved from the Louisiana Purchase. We bought it, we paid for it, and General Torrijos should be told we're going to keep it.
In November 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in a landslide election victory. Eight months later, on the night of July 31st, 1981, Omar Torrijos was killed in a fiery plane crash. The circumstances of the incident are unclear. Authorities said that his plane crashed into the side of a mountain, but witnesses said that the plane exploded in flight. Although his death was officially declared an accident, many suspect that he was assassinated. Some think that Manuel Noriega may have been involved, but many are convinced it was the CIA that was responsible.
I'm quite convinced that the CIA killed Torrijos, and this I know quite well because I work with Torrijos. And
Jose Chuchu Martinez was one of Torrijos' closest aides for many years.
They killed him precisely at the moment they had to kill him, at the moment that Torrijos was having a big influence over Central America, especially among the revolutionary movements. They killed Torrijos because Torrijos represented precisely the political solution of the whole Central American problem.
Waiting in the wings for his chance to take power was Colonel Manuel Noriega, the CIA's primary contact in Panama. Noriega was head of Panama's military intelligence and had a long-standing relationship with the United States. He had been on the CIA payroll since the 60s. When George Bush became director of the CIA in 1976, under President Ford, he inherited Noriega as a contact. Despite evidence that Noriega was involved in drug trafficking, Bush kept Noriega on the payroll. In fact, he increased Noriega's salary to more than $100,000 a year and eliminated a requirement that intelligence reports on Panama include information on drug trafficking.
Over the last 20 years, since Manuel Noriega was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to be an asset, he has obviously provided many, many important pieces of information to U.S. intelligence.
Peter Kornblue is senior analyst at the National Security Archive. The archive has assembled hundreds of previously classified government documents revealing the details of Noriega's relationship to U.S. intelligence.
They've paid him an incredible amount of money, of American taxpayers' money, and obviously decided that his value to them was so important that his drug smuggling and other illegal activity could simply be ignored.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States, that I will support and defend...
After George Bush became vice president under Ronald Reagan in 1981, he was named head of the administration's anti-drug campaign and once again took responsibility for monitoring Noriega's intelligence activities.
Bush, in fact, seems to have been instrumental, even according to the documented evidence the administration itself has made available, in seeing to it that Noriega was well taken care of. And in fact, Admiral Stansfield Turner, the former director of the CIA under Carter, claims that he cut Noriega off, that he removed him from the U.S. payroll. Bush put him back on and, in fact, gave him a raise and developed an even closer relationship than had existed before.
With support from the CIA, Noriega was able to outmaneuver his rivals, and in August of 1983, he became commander of the Panamanian military. As the Reagan administration expanded its covert war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, Noriega became increasingly helpful. Working with the CIA and with Israeli arms dealers, Noriega helped coordinate an arms supply network to provide weapons to Contra bases in northern Costa Rica.
That is by now undeniable that the same planes that were carrying arms from Panama into Costa Rica were also carrying drugs. And in fact, the people who were the pilots flying those arms to the Contras and flying drugs on up, eventually reaching the United States, have been indicted and are now serving time.
This operation essentially gave Manuel Noriega the assurance that they would turn a blind eye to his continued brokering of cocaine deals in return for using his network to get the arms to the Contras in northern Costa Rica.
Noriega's involvement in the drug traffic really increased his importance as a source for the CIA and as someone who was able to conduct dirty tricks in the region for the CIA. So it's no accident that the CIA became the most prominent defenders of Noriega against the drug charges, because that's the sort of thing which CIA clients tend to do. Time after time, when we install strongmen in the third world, because we want them to be strong, we want to see them involved with the strongest local economic forces, which time after time are the drug traffic.
Despite Noriega's collaboration with many U.S. covert operations, he was becoming increasingly uncooperative with U.S. objectives in Central America. In 1984, he angered the Reagan administration by hosting Latin American leaders at the Contadora peace talks. The talks called for an end to U.S. intervention in Central American affairs.
Noriega was not the yes man that the United States wanted him to be. He simply didn't like to be pushed around. He certainly didn't like people like John Poindexter or even William Casey coming down to his villa and telling him what he should do or what he shouldn't do.
Then in 1986, the Iran-Contra scandal erupted. Noriega's primary contacts in the administration were now under intense scrutiny.
Oliver North was fired, Poindexter was forced to resign, and William Casey fell ill with a brain tumor. So all three of Noriega's major protectors were out of government, and that led quickly to a shift in U.S. policy.
Sentiments within Panama were turning against Noriega as well. For 3 years, Noriega worked with the DEA in a sting operation codenamed Operation Pisces. In 1987, with Noriega's assistance, authorities arrested hundreds of suspects and froze millions of dollars in Panama's banks, severely disrupting the money laundering business. The financial community was outraged, and Noriega's opponents mobilized against him. Back in Washington, Noriega's opponents lobbied and testified against him, accusing him of murder, corruption, and drug running. The U.S. media quickly turned it into a major story.
United States, but relations with Panama are under a new cloud tonight because of news reports
Senator
alleging...
Jesse Helms charged today that the military strongman of Panama, Manuel Noriega, is the #1 drug trafficker in the Americas. Helms said, depending on how the situation with
the
Noriega
reports from U.S. intelligence have also led to new investigations on Capitol Hill.
Faced with increased pressure, both in the U.S. and Panama, Noriega introduced a wave of brutal repression, attacking protesters in the streets and jailing hundreds of opponents. The Reagan administration now openly called for his removal.
We do want Noriega out of there and a return to a civilian democratic government.
But behind the scenes, the the administration was secretly negotiating with Noriega, promising not to indict him on drug charges if he would cooperate with U.S. objectives in Central America. Gabriel Gemma, director of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on the U.S. invasion of Panama, spoke to Noriega about his negotiations with the U.S.
General Noriega told us that there were a number of demands placed on him directly, both through Poindexter and other meetings, where the State Department pressured him to change the Panamanian government's policy on several issues. He said that by far the most pressing was a demand by the United States that Noriega and the Panamanian government allow the U.S. to expand their military presence in Panama and to renegotiate the treaties to allow them to keep control over the 14 bases, military bases, that presently exist in Panama.
Noriega refused to agree to the U.S. demands or to relinquish his power in Panama. In February 1988, 2 U.S. federal grand juries in Florida indicted Noriega, accusing him of drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering. It was the first time a foreign head of state had ever been indicted in the United States. The U.S. now undertook a systematic effort to overthrow Noriega. Economic sanctions were stepped up and additional troops were dispatched to Panama.
The United States tonight declared in effect that Panama's General Manuel Noriega is a threat to this country's national security.
Mr. Noriega, the drug-related indicted dictator of Panama. We want to bring him to justice, we want to get him out, and we want to restore democracy to Panama. And so when you read these outrageous charges by a drug-related indicted dictator, discount them. They are total lies.
Still unable to force Noriega from power, the United States turned its efforts to influencing the upcoming 1989 Panamanian national elections.
All right, and for time, we do need to stop there. But this entire movie is available on YouTube, The Panamanian Deception. It's about an hour or 30 minutes. It's a really fascinating watch, and I do recommend it. And we'll go to our last discussion round now.
Yes, I just want to mention that I have the opportunity as a teenager to meet Torrijos. He was true in nationalism and tried to take care of his people. In Panama, a lot of Panamanians despise Manuel Noriega. We have a special nickname for him. We used to call him Pineapple Face. And all the intrigues that were under him. When I was living in this apartment on Aki Street, below my apartment building, below in the second floor, he was living Giraldi, and he tried to do an upright against Noriega, and he was literally killed. They shot him down already, killed him, and his body was disappeared. It was terrifying living in an environment that people would walk on the street and they will be killed for XYZ reasons.
Goodness, thank you.
I don't have the full details on this, but what was interesting, but the Panamanian People's Party, formerly known as the Panamanian Communist Party, actually was de-recognized by the Electoral Tribune back in 1991 after Operation Just Cause. I thought that was interesting. I don't know the full details on that, but I thought that was interesting.
Well, considering how much the U.S. was involved in getting any communist party, even by name, decertified, I'm sure would be a good objective of theirs.
I don't know if anyone noticed, but Elizabeth Montgomery from Bewitched is the narrator in this documentary.
Oh, good catch. Oh, I did not notice that. Interesting.
Yeah, the Communist Party always existed since I left, and I started in Czechoslovakia in 1978 is when I left. The Communist Party existed in Panama because they were sending several students, actually militants, to Russia, to USSR to study. And I know a couple of them in Panama, and in other countries they relocated, but I wasn't aware that I got recognized after 1991.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Angelo, General Secretary Emeritus, you have the floor.
Yeah, I worked with a Gabriella. I knew her. It was good to see her again in the movie. She was with the International Action Center, which was a mass group set up by Workers' World Party. And they were the ones who did all the stuff on Panama. It was really Workers' World Party that did all the stuff, the solidarity movement. It was very interesting. And there were mass meetings in New York, and Gabriella was the one who was the key person there. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Carmen Angelo.
Yeah, I just wanted to, point out, they, in it you hear Reagan, George Bush Sr., etc., talking about, they keep emphasizing that Noriega was a drug lord, as if that was something they actually cared about, given that under Reagan, the CIA was smuggling drugs into the cities of the US, which, disproportionately imprisoned the black population. I mean, we have over 1 million people incarcerated today, most of them because of drug charges that the CIA was responsible for. Not only that, but in Afghanistan, when the CIA overthrew the PDPA, and put in the Taliban, they encouraged the Taliban to grow opium or poppy so that they could fund their anti-communist feudal regime. So they don't care about drugs at all. It's just a justification for them.
Well, and also the movie mentioned that George H.W. first got in contact with Noriega under Carter, but before that, he had been involved in the CIA all the way back to the 60s, so he probably knew about this guy a long time ago, and especially with Noriega going to the School of the Americas, it's very likely George H.W. knew him a lot earlier than that.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. So there was an aide, I believe, to President Carter who said in the late 90s and early 2000s, so this is like 40 years later, he said the following: the war on drugs was really two things. It was a war on leftists in Latin America, and it was a war on minorities in the United States. And this movie mentioned what the truth was, because it wasn't just out of Panama and Costa Rica, but there's a military base in Honduras that was used where planes were flown to Texas. And so the planes would fly down to Texas loaded with material for the Contras, medical, ammunition, weapons, things that they needed, technology. And then it would fly back from Honduras to Texas with drugs. And then this would be distributed. This is where all the gangs, things like the movie Colors, all that stuff, that made up stuff, it's made up by our government against our own people. And that's why that stuff flourished in the 80s. And then to go really quickly on this, the time of Vietnam, this is where the CIA became the world's drug dealers. It was actually the French in the 50s. There's a movie called The French Connection. This is one of the opening firings, like fusillades of the Cold War, was you could say the bourgeoisie, not just the United States government, but the bourgeoisie itself used crime to fight trade unions. And in our country, this meant the trade unions, like the longshoremen's unions, and the drugs, they came to finance the crime. It came from Southeast Asia. It's called the Golden Triangle. And this was used to fund the French who were trying to fight communists in Vietnam, and they lost. And it said, the stuff still continues at Golden Triangle, but much less than it used to. And a lot of that drug production, the heroin, the poppy, was moved to Afghanistan. It was moved to Afghanistan. And the Taliban have not really, some of them are religious fundamentalists, and so they burn the poppy fields. And so where has it moved now? To Colombia and Mexico. It's still in Afghanistan. It's still in the Golden Triangle, but it's right here in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Chris, California. Really quickly, Emeritus Secretary Angelo, did you have something else? I noticed your hand was still up.
Yeah, there was a movie made when they showed you the airplane. Remember you saw that white plane? There was a movie called Con Air. I don't know if you ever heard of it or seen it. I think it's with Sylvester Stallone. I'm not sure, but it's one of those actors. It's called Con Air. It's all about the CIA in the Contra area using, being involved with drugs, getting drugs. And this is a big movie that was watched in Hollywood. So it's common knowledge that the CIA was involved with drug smuggling at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. I also found it funny how one of the newspaper headlines in the movie, in the clip we saw, was Reagan didn't know he had all these psychopaths running around, where it's more than likely that Reagan himself knew everything about all this.
I'll keep it as brief as possible, but yeah, I'm here in DC. This is one of the like epicenters of the drug war and everything like that, to the point where I think it would be important for our local cell to focus mass work on like cleaning up some of the areas where a lot of drug activity be happening and everything like that, in order to gain popularity amongst the masses, because there's just a huge neglect when it comes to that problem. Because deindustrialization, a lot of the younger generation get into that economic field and get locked up, house arrest and all that type of stuff, and then the older generation buys it, and it's just this constant cycle of that allows for counterinsurgency and policing within our communities. And as well as eventually doing like a Black liberation led class on it, because it's very, very, like all the other comrades have stated, very interlinked with anti-leftist movements. It's a reason why a lot of heavily deindustrialized, heavily sedated areas are on Martin Luther King Jr. boulevards within Black majority sections of urban centers within the United States of America.
Thank you, Comrade. And yeah, it was crack cocaine at one point and fentanyl today. So it's just continuing.
I was actually going to ask if this was all connected to the crack epidemic of the 80s, because I know that was a big thing with the with the war on drugs. So I didn't know if this had anything to do with that, if some of the drugs that were used in that were brought through from the Panama from this whole Panama incident or not.
Yes, they were.
Well, not to that specifically, but there's definitely that. I think it was around this time. I think the famous scene with George Bush in the Oval Office with a bag of cocaine, saying that, oh, we found this right in front of the White House. We had to arrest someone. And he used that obviously for political reasons. But the thing that I was going to bring up was what was mentioned by Reagan at the beginning. He said, and it may have been Panama, the country itself, but it sounded like he said Panama Canal. That was American. It was just as American as the Louisiana Purchase or Alaska was, which, makes this concept of just like this very agreeable contract that there were two sides and nothing bad happened between one side or the other, that they just agreed together and nothing, it was just an agreeable contract, which ignores everything. But, also Panama is its own country. And it's not actually, by law owned by the U.S. Of course, we could see how it is controlled. But, how was that an illegal act to even do on a different country is beyond me. But obviously, that's a rhetorical question, because I think we know the answers to that. But that's all.
Thank you, Comrade.
I'm just going to say this briefly to tap on what Comrade said, but yes, the part of the whole reason that there's the conspiracy that the CIA put crack cocaine in American neighborhoods is due to this. I don't want to veer off too long because I feel like that could be a whole class of its own, but yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Dr. Angela, who was that Gabriella person again you mentioned? I forget the rest of her name from the
Gabriella Gemma. Gemma.
Okay, and and Chris, who was you said that war on drugs was a war on minorities in America and the left in Latin America? Who was that again?
So it was one of the someone in the administration of Jimmy Carter, I believe. Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
Although
I think it was actually an aide to Richard Nixon that said that.
I think you're right. It was a Nixon aide. Yeah.
It was the war on drugs. We invented it for two reasons. One was to get the leftists. The other was to get the minorities. That's an issue. So yes.
Hi. So so I've seen like a lot of the drug epidemic and just how it like affects and keeps people down. I'm curious on how much from the crack cocaine epidemic is still in play to today. As far as like modern times, it's obviously changed to like fentanyl and heroin, et cetera, et cetera. Definitely methamphetamines, and just how much like government is involved with these issues today.
I definitely saw some hands shoot up at that one.
Current president of the United States of America, Joe Biden, has a son, Hunter Biden, who smokes crack. I think it was 2 July 4th ago, or it was either 2022 or 2023. They found cocaine in the White House as well during the July 4th celebration. Cocaine has become the sales allegedly of cocaine and cocaine arrest, due to information based on police records as well as drug rehabilitation. Crack is still alive. Cocaine is still alive. Yeah, they're still very popular to this very day.
But let it be said that Hunter Biden was never convicted of cocaine use, but of possessing a firearm while smoking crack.
So yeah, on the question, is it something that's relevant today? Yes, it is. And so it comes into the question of why our government allows this to happen. And I bring this up, I'm from California. So the president of China came to San Francisco and the streets were cleaned up in a couple days. Barriers were put up, all the people were pushed off to the side. I've traveled around the country. I want to name certain places: Kensington, Philadelphia. Everybody should look up Kensington. You need to see it, but I'm sure your city looks like that in certain areas. Where I'm from in California, it's quite bad. We call it here kind of Skid Row, but basically every city's like that. And the question is, why would the leadership of our country do that? Why would the leadership of our country import entire communities? And when we talk about Angelo mentioned a movie. There was also a movie made by like a young Mel Gibson, I think, about the airlines, the biggest airlines that the CIA ran in the world at the time during the Vietnam War. It was in Laos. A lot of people don't talk about it. I know this from an old neighbor, person from where I'm from. He was a veteran. There's a thing called the Secret War that went on in Laos and Cambodia. It was almost the same size as the Vietnam War. It's never talked about. And according to my neighbor, who is, he's actually a Veterans for Peace member, former president in San Diego of their chapter. He said he even saw them shooting the atomic Annies, like the nuclear artillery, at mountaintops. This is like in deep jungles. But basically, that's what he said in his own, but I can't verify that. But he said he saw it with his own eyes. In Southeast Asia, it's forest, it's jungle, it's very remote. You can only get there with donkeys. And the mountains were these little villages, and this is where the poppy seed comes from, and the people cultivate it, kind of like in Peru, Bolivia. People chew the coca leaves. It doesn't do anything, but when you fabricate it or you put it in a factory, you can turn it into these substances. And so at a time, it was used to finance. The CIA would fly these little planes, like the little bush planes, and come to the little villages, and they would cultivate the resin, like the poppy resin, and then that would be fabricated. And obviously, the result was the drug epidemics. But also, what happened in '71 was our country changed because we got off the gold standard. So then we didn't have to have the secret money raising anymore because we could just get all the money we wanted. And as I mentioned earlier, things like National Endowment for Democracy, things changed. The way the money could be funneled changed. So it raises the question, why is this continuing to this day? One theory I've heard is the following for two reasons. One is to destroy societies, like Mexico. It's a sovereign country, so let's destroy their people. Destroy it with the drugs. And then number two, the bourgeoisie in our country, they like drugs. They need it. They use it. And we just mentioned one, Hunter Biden. There's another guy, he's like the heir of the Bush family. They produce the beer. He's like the beer monopoly. And you should look this guy up. He's killed like 2 women. He's like crashed cars. He's like a tweaker. He's like, he flies helicopters and jets because he's just a billionaire bourgeoisie. Has nothing in common with anyone on this phone call. These people have nothing in common, the bourgeoisie. And they need these drugs. Thank you.
You comrade.
Yeah, I just wanted to say with like recent years, like we've had like a resurgence with like heroin and fentanyl along with it. Something I kind of saw just growing up is around like 2010, 2011, 2013 era, the big thing people were doing was oxycodone, which eventually that just got stopped being made. And it was just as strong as heroin, which led directly to this resurgence. So like our government has like a very deep history of being involved in the drug trade, and nothing is coming out yet about modern times, but give it 10, 15 years. I bet we'll figure out our government was somehow shadily involved in this.
I know that company made record profits for that, and no one's ever been indicted for. Well, I think they may have had hearings, but no one ever got charged or indicted for all that.
Yeah, I'm probably the only one here who lived through the 60s. I think we're the only ones who lived through the 60s. Oh, and your mom, okay. In the United States, there was a lot of drugs. It was really the drug generation. And I never got involved with it because I was too busy in the communist movement. I had no time for drugs. But I've noticed that whenever people took drugs in college, they were quiet and they were mollified. It was like a sedative. They didn't get involved in any political activity when they were involved with drugs. I've noticed that. In fact, I told you the story many times. We were having a table against the military at Wagner College in Staten Island, military recruities, and everybody had to be at this table for a few hours in order to fight the military. And I wound up being there the whole day, never went to any classes, because the guy that was supposed to cover me and for me to go to my classes never showed up. So I went to his room later on, and there was that horrid smell. Well, I hate that smell, that sweet smell of marijuana. And he was on the floor, and I said to him, "What happened? Why aren't you at the table?" He said, "I'm trying to find myself." I'll never forget this. So I took a mirror that was there, and I put it in front of him. I said, "Here you are. Now you know where you are." I said, "Now get out to the table against the military." That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Yes, amazing. So as far as the effects going on today, I believe a certain percentage of the firearms used by the cartel are leftovers from the Contra War, and it's also worth to mention, I think about 70% of them also are smuggled in directly from the United States. And I guess on another note, there was an intervention backed by Hillary Clinton, of all people, to overthrow the government of Honduras in 2009. Manuel Zelaya, I think, was his name. Anyway, he got replaced, and Honduras basically became the murder capital of the world at that point. And if I'm not mistaken, the former president and his brother were recently indicted by the Drug Enforcement Agency here in New York City. But yeah.
Thank you, Comrade.
Yeah, on the comments of the cartel. So I live between Mexico and the United States.
and my wife's family, they're police officers. She worked there. She worked for the Fiscalía General in homicidio. So she worked in the Attorney General in homicide. She was a lawyer. Her family, her aunt was the head coroner in Tijuana. Let's explain what are cartels. These people are not Mexican. If you look at their arms, the guns they have, the uniforms they have, it comes from our country, United States mainly. The cartel in Mexico, in Syria, it's called Islamic State. In Ukraine, it's called Azov. They are mercenaries for the United States. And I heard the word smuggling. Comrades, it was not smuggling that occurred recently in Mexico. So what happened was the following, and this should be looked up. Comrades should research this. With Obama, it's called gun walking. Gun walking. So the DEA, people went to gun stores in our country and they bought it legally with money. They support the gun industry, I suppose. And then they just walked across the border and then they gave it to criminals in Mexico. Our government did that. And so the people in Mexico, these are people like real Mexicans, not mercenaries for the United States. They said, hey, stop doing this. And it became a scandal. Of course, no one talks about it now. So cartels, ISIS, Azov battalion, it's the United States, comrades. That's what it is. And it's not us. It's not the people. It's the government. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. For the time is now 9:25. We do need to go to our wrap up and announcements. So if we can get that slide up. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house. Please visit newoutlookpublishers.store for the latest releases. We didn't really have any books that would fit the idea of the Panama Canal, but our latest releases are Karl Marx's famous Wage, Labor, and Capital, as well as we've had some of our more recent releases as well from Socialism and Communism in the Soviet Union, Marxism and Modern Idealism, and Fascism and Social Revolution. And in fact, next PSMLS will be on Fascism and Social Revolution. So get your copies soon if you would like to have a more deeper dive into that, with more details to come. And we will close out tonight with the hymn of the national anthem of Panama.